Hello, I'm Dirk Martin with University Communications at CU Boulder. I am talking with Elizabeth Dunn, CU Boulder Associate Professor of Geography and International Affairs, about a new study she just published concerning the effects that war has on refugees, or what are officially labeled IDPs, short for Internally Displaced People. For 11 months, Dunn lived in a refugee camp with villagers forced out of their homes during the 2008 Russian invasion of the region of South Ossetia in the Republic of Georgia. The war forced the relocation of some 28,000 people into refugee camps made up of small huts packed tightly together. An interesting aspect of this study is that Dunn never intended to study IDPs. She originally was going to Georgia to study the effects of new world safety standards on Georgia's export industry. But then the war broke out. Professor Dunn, where were you when the war began?
So the day we were supposed to fly out to Georgia, I got a call from the State Department, from the Fulbright people, saying that I should get off the plane because the Russians had invaded. And so that threw everything kind of up in the air. And there wasn't going to be any food export. I mean, one reason is that the food processing plant where I had hoped to do my study was destroyed during the war. The other issue is that there just wasn't food coming out of the fields. So the orchards in this part of Georgia were covered, carpeted in cluster bombs, unexploded ordnance. So they were in the orchards and people couldn't go in to harvest.
At what point did you decide to change the focus of your study?
I spent a week holed up in a hotel in Michigan because we'd gotten as far as O'Hare Airport, trying to figure out what to do next. Oh my God, what am I going to do next? And I realized that it wasn't ever really the food that I was interested in. It was the people, and the people who made that food, who were the farmers whose situation I was really interested in understanding, now had a radically different situation because they'd been forced off their land. So I decided to stay with them and see what happened to them after they had been so amazingly displaced.
And how difficult was it to change gears?
Just finding out with some kind of accuracy what was happening, where people were going, where they were sleeping, how many people were being displaced, was just a massive undertaking in the first days of the war. Ethnic Georgians had been living in villages south of the capital, which was Skin Valley. And for whatever reason, and there may have been reason for the Georgian president to think that the Russians were invading, that may have been a fabrication. Nobody really knows why he decided to attack, but he shot first on the capital, Skin Valley. And in retribution, the Ossetians and the Russians went to these Georgian villages that were around Skin Valley and bombed them and then looted them. Then those houses were burned. And after they were burned, in some villages they were bulldozed to make sure that the Georgians could never return. So we're dealing with people who are victims of ethnic cleansing. And the point was to drive them out and make sure they could never come in again. And there is nothing left for them to come back to.
We should tell people that the pictures they are seeing in this podcast are from photographer Hannah Mintek, a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer who lives in Georgia. Professor Dunn, what did you find in your study that is surprising?
The first thing I found out is that providing humanitarian aid is an enormously complex undertaking, and it's not well coordinated at all. So the system that the United Nations has in order to coordinate the work of all these different groups doesn't function very well. And so a lot of the aid that came in was useless. The Japanese government sent secondhand clothes. How big are Japanese people, So there were a lot of very well-dressed 12-year-olds for a while. A lot of aid was reduplicated. So the same groups were hitting the same group of people all the time while another group of refugees was getting nothing. And a lot of the aid that was coming in was being given on the basis of models that were totally inappropriate, that were models derived from sub-Saharan Africa. And so the aid agencies would come in knowing nothing about Georgia and give them services that were meant to help people from the Congo. And a lot of the aid that was offered was like that. It was useless. It was money that was spent to fulfill the agendas of donors rather than the real needs of refugees. So I think my first finding was that even in a situation where the humanitarian machine was operating at full gear, much of what happened there was of no use. Much of the aid that was given was useless and inappropriate.
You said the refugees can't go back to South Ossetia and farm or work in the factories because the Russians occupy the area. You also said that since many of the camps are far from urban areas, that the prospects of finding work are poor. So without a connection to their past and without steady work, how has refugee life changed the cultural identity of these people?
In Georgia, a primary source of people's identity is their village identity, what village you're from. What happened was, first of all, that when they were displaced from those villages, these huge, deep social ties were just shattered. And so even though people could move, 5 or 6 households together into a settlement, and they would try and move close to each other so that all of the people from Ksawisi village lived on this end of a street in the settlement, those important ties and that important source of identity was really disrupted. One of the things that was challenging for me as an ethnographer is that all the things that I was used to doing with people as a form of participant observation were gone. Churches were gone, people's homes were gone, their fields were gone, their jobs were gone, any of their little businesses were gone. So my field work before this had generally been in factories. And so, when things got quiet, you always had work to do. And here we spent hours and hours and hours doing absolutely nothing.
You have just been listening to Elizabeth Dunn, CU Boulder Associate Professor of Geography and International Affairs, talking about her new study concerning the effects war has on displaced people in the Republic of Georgia. For CU Boulder University Communications, I'm Dirk Martin.